where the commitment of not putting protectionist measures in place, and these commitments were renewed several times. I think this was very important because after the global crisis there was a big concern that economies would close up. But of course more recently we've seen trade issues, trade concerns and conflicts flare up, and very deservedly this has now taken a bigger part of the agenda of the G20. Although so far I would say without a lot of tangible outcomes. But this is clearly an issue that has come on the agenda in the last few years. And then more generally, I think we see a much broader focus on issues that relate to sustainable development and inclusion. And I mean, the Argentine ambassador and the Argentinian agenda this year clearly points this out. And again, I think this is a response of the leaders to some concerns, growing concerns about the inclusiveness of the global economic order and the open economic environment that we have seen come up, and that ultimately have also driven some of these protectionist tendencies. So this is very understandable, and I think there have been a number of areas actually where interesting progress has been made. Now, looking ahead to the next presidencies, what do we think, or where could we think about where the focus will be? With looking at the global conjunction, the global environment, and what we do see now is that this broad economic expansion that the world has experienced over the last, say, 18 months is now becoming a bit more divergent. So we have some countries that are still growing fast, but in other countries we see growth slowing. And at the same time also, and I don't have to tell you that because I'm sure you read the newspaper every day, the global financial environment has become much more volatile. I think somebody asserted here we've seen some wild swings in stock financial markets, emerging markets, currencies have been under pressure. We have seen capital outflows. So this environment of this very benign financial environment of low global interest rate and ample liquidity is changing, and that is raising, of course, both of these things are raising challenges, economic challenges for the world economy. And therefore, I could think that some of the financial architecture issues that had taken a bit more of a backseat may now again become more prominent on the agenda and in the discussions among both in the finance track, but even among leaders. Clearly. So one of the issues, of course, that the current situation brings up is the issue of the global financial safety net, and how this safety net can be strengthened. And there are some outstanding issues there that weren't covered really in the previous sprint that we had in this area. Work has started or had started on the issue of IMF financial facilities, to the extent how can they become a kind of more of a liquidity support type of liquidity support nature. That is certainly something that you could see up. There's an ongoing work, an ongoing discussion about the use of capital flow management measures. And there are also some of the issues of financing, IMF financing, that might come back to the discussion. The world today is in a much better shape in many ways. One of those is that we have a much stronger regulatory framework. We do have also, the IMF has substantially increased its ability to support the membership. Our firepower is about $1 trillion, but part of these resources are borrowed, and these borrowed resources have to be renewed, or at least has to be a discussion whether this is needed. So I would say, I think these issues will certainly be there. And there's also issues of governance still there. After the 14th review, we have a 15th review of quota, and a quota review for the IMF is not just fresh capital, but they are important because they allow the membership to redistribute voting power across countries. And with emerging markets growing so much faster than advanced economies, and they are currently underrepresented in the IMF. And that is a matter of concern. Therefore, kind of finishing the 15th quota review, which is targeted for 2019, I think will be a critical issue on the agenda. But there are other areas also outside of the finance track. Certainly there's the issue of trade reform and WTO reform. There are issues about lender development assistance and lender coordination, the role of new lenders and the Paris Club. There's a whole set of issues, and I do think that sometimes addressing them individually can be quite challenging, because the interests of country groups may not be necessarily aligned. So there may be some of the reforms that are of great interest and benefit for advanced economies, and others that are of more benefit and interest for the developing world. So for instance, the institutional reform of the IMF and the quota reform is of great interest to the developing world. I think the issue of WTO reform is of more interest to advanced economies. And there is potential, and this is where the political dimension comes in, to really look for a grand bargain. To look at these issues not separately, but to look at them together. So I think this is one of the challenges that the presidency will feel forward. From our perspective, I think also a renewed focus on supply side reform, on productivity enhancing structural reform is warranted. Some of that is already there, the infrastructure focus. But more generally, I think what we expect over the medium term is that global growth will slow. That growth potentials are lower today than they were before the global crisis, and therefore that also should hopefully bring some interest in kind of taking a fresh look at this area, especially because the 2 and 5 commitment from Brisbane essentially ends this year. Now, finally, I think there's also for every presidency a challenge of trying to do something and to work and to seek to enhance the effectiveness of the G20 process and the traction. We saw the Argentinian ambassador showed a bit how big this process has become, with all kinds of engagement groups. I think 7 engagement groups, and we just heard that we have also brought in parliamentarians in the judiciary. There are, I think, by now about 9 different ministerial engagements there as well. There's a big agenda that is being covered there, and the topics have also broadened. So trying to keep focus, I think, is also always a call, and I think there's been some progress made. That the communique in Germany was, I think, a bit more circumscribed. I'm very happy to hear that you're looking for actionable and short communique. I think we look forward to that. But I think also in terms of the focus, I think it's important for the G20 members to be selective and so that really the energies can focus on some key issues. And I think there's two big criteria that we should always keep in mind. One is that the G20 naturally should focus on issues where collective action by all will facilitate actually the viability of implementing a measure. So overcome some of the political barriers, some of the resistance. It's often easier if we take collective steps than when they're taken alone, and or where also collective action might yield positive externalities. That was the case with the structural reform agenda, for example, where we were able to show that if all countries in the world undertake structural reforms to enhance productivity, there will be an added bonus. So 1 + 1 is not 2, but a bit more than 2. So I think these are classic areas where the G20 really can make a difference. Of course, also there should be issues where really movement by the G20 members is critical. There might be some broader global issues where you really need not just the G20, but you need broader memberships to be present, and those might be dealt with in other fora. But I think these are 2 important criteria if you want to think about how to circumscribe a little bit and focus the agenda. And finally, I think one of the issues that the G20 has been struggling with is the issue of incentives to deliver. So we want deliverable communiques, guidance from the leaders. But then, of course, after it, one thing is for the outcomes to be deliverable, but the other one is to deliver ultimately. So there's an implementation step that comes after that. And creating incentives to deliver at the country level, I think this is also an important issue where the G20 could usefully do some rethink. In the past, what the mechanism to deliver has been one of peer pressure, and but over time, I think the accountability mechanisms have become weaker. It started with the mutual assessment process at the beginning. That was kind of a peer-led process. There were accountability assessments later, and now there is a mechanism still to assess these 5+2 commitments, but it is relatively weak, I would say, or relatively modest, and it shows up mostly in the action plans. So I think here there is also a sense of a deliverable outcome, actionable communiques, but also then maybe some rethink about how we follow up on those and how we make sure that these actually translate in action. I think these are some of the challenges that the G20 will be looking at in the next years. Thank you. I'll leave it here.
Thank you very much. That has been a very rich set of presentations that we've heard. I think what I would propose to do is perhaps highlight some of the important points that each of our panelists have made, and then perhaps throw up a couple of cross-cutting issues that might help our further discussion in this. The Ambassador of Argentina made a couple of very salient points. Firstly, that the G20, being a member-driven process and not having a permanent secretariat, has the capacity to actually reflect what members want and regard as urgent. He noted the potential for policy convergence that arises as a result of this, and that this policy convergence relates not just to the economic or the macroeconomic, but also the political. And that is, I think, an important idea, bringing together leaders as this forum does. The ambassador highlighted the importance of consensus, of working together, therefore, of focusing on things that all of us can agree on. And about the need to navigate the agenda, given the increasing number of inputs from affinity groups. This is a point that Dr. Bauer also made, but I think this is an extremely important challenge. Mr. Ansari, and I think we're very glad that we have you here, because in a sense you were present at the creation since you were at the Pittsburgh Summit. You spoke of this as the premier forum for global economic coordination, and given the weight of the countries that comprise the G20, I think that's hugely significant. You said that it's early to talk of what the outcomes of Osaka will be, but clearly there will be continuities from what happens or is discussed at Buenos Aires. There are difficulties of global governance, including that of increasing protectionism, and I think that's a huge challenge at this point. You mentioned the fact, Mr. Ansari, that this was a vehicle for crisis management, but now has to change into one which allows for coordination of policy. I think the Japanese priorities that were highlighted are very, very important. And you said that climate change and the importance of future-oriented technologies in this regard is something which is of critical importance to us, as is the other point you made about accelerating the virtuous cycle of climate protection. I think this is perhaps the foremost challenge in coming years. The importance of addressing the infrastructure deficit of developing countries and of debt management for low-income countries. The ambassador of Saudi Arabia spoke again of the importance of continuities from the Buenos Aires summit as also the Osaka summit. And looking at what Saudi Arabia will attach importance to given the ongoing national reform process within. The importance of energy security and maintaining balance in oil markets and the need for global cooperation to this end, and also the importance of identifying topical issues on which cooperation would be most useful. I think that's a very, very important point. Dr. Bauer, speaking for the IMF, made some very valuable points. You spoke of the institutional importance of the G20 framework for global economic governance, and also noted that in recent summits, the issue of financial architecture has not perhaps received the same salience because we seem to be in a better place on this subject, but that the issue of enhanced financial resources in terms of the quota system does require an early outcome. I think that was a very important point, that we need to perhaps enhance provisioning should require an early outcome, and perhaps that's an opportunity missed. From my side, I would like to mention a couple of points. I think the fact that the G20 brings together countries of such economic and political weight gives deliberations and outcomes of the G20 a significance which cannot be overstated. However, at this point in time, there are some important issues that can perhaps set a perspective. Are we at this point in time at an inflection point in terms of the state of the global economy? Is the present risk quotient very high? I think this is something that our participants may wish to comment on. We see that the positive value of global trade is being challenged. And this is not just by disenchanted citizens or disaffected groups, but is also being challenged by governments which are raising protectionist walls. What does this mean for the global economic recovery? We now are looking at the prospect of a weaponization of trade. And that is something that the G20 will obviously consider and discuss. Domestic policy constraints are developing across the board and are becoming more salient across the board. So how much space does that leave for the G20 as a group to maneuver? And where else can the G20 contribute? In terms of global governance, is there a space for the G20 to deliver in terms of global political governance, not just economic governance? The issue of how G20 member states will look at the challenge of responding to the IPCC report which recently came out. Because now we are apparently at a point when we're looking at a 3 degrees plus rise in global temperature levels. Again, the weight of the G20 economies being what it is, I think how the G20 member states respond to this is something which will determine how we perform globally. Lastly, in terms of discussions on the future of work and the challenge of the fourth industrial revolution, artificial intelligence, and that set of issues. So on all of these, I invite members of the panel if they wish to speak, and of course members of the audience if they wish to comment, observe, question. You have the floor, sir.
The panel first? Or?
Whichever way you like. I'm easy.
Well, thank you very much, Chair, and my compliments to all of the speakers. Suman Berry, I used to be the Director General of the National Council of Applied Economic Research, and I've been doing a retrospective of the summit process at the 10-year mark. If I could ask two somewhat unrelated questions. Andreas, you talked about financial architecture, and I think in the last 24 hours, we've actually seen the report of the Eminent Persons Group that was commissioned right before Hamburg. Now, what struck me on a quick reading of that is, while there's a lot about the future interaction between the G20 and the international financial institutions, something that was very present at the time of the crisis, indeed Gordon Brown made a a big deal of it in May of 2009, namely the need for a fresh Bretton Woods, a look at the international monetary order, something that Tommaso Padoa-Schioppa has also been stressing. That seems to have disappeared from the agenda, even though, as it were, the exorbitant privilege of the dollar was railed against, has been railed against by the Chinese. So my question is this an elephant in the room which nobody is willing to see because they can't see action, or is it unimportant? And I guess my question to the representatives of the present chair and the future chair would be, we are learning to deal with a somewhat different United States from the one that everybody had gotten used to. Do you see signs? And would you be promoting the concept of variable geometry, which is to say that on different issues, are you finding that other members, be the Europeans or the Chinese, that they are stepping up to the plate to take on issues to make good for the leadership vacuum with the United States behaving in a slightly peculiar way?
Would you care to, Ambassador? With both of you present.
Okay, I'll be very quick. I think I'll answer the second question and leaving the first question to financial experts. But the question on dealing somewhat different U.S. But I think we shouldn't overemphasize the kind of a leadership vacuum, so-called, because U.S. continue to play an important role in all aspects of international relations, and also it still has a will and capacity to do so. And so I think the important thing is, of course, so we have, at times the countries have differences on issues like trade or climate change. But taking climate change itself, US also made it clear that it will continue to work on reducing greenhouse gases and also help other countries to access clean energy. So I think important point, especially for G20, is to try to find a common ground upon which to work on. And so rather than emphasizing differences. And I think that is exactly what G20 colleagues has been doing in the process run up to Buenos Aires.
Thank you so much. Well, I think that my colleague from Japan has been giving us some important comments. On my case, I will just tell you that I overemphasized during the whole presentation the question of consensus. And I think that that's the word that we should be looking at the summit. We do have the expectations that during the summit, and that's what we want to happen, is that the leaders can get together, can talk about these issues, and they have a common responsibility to face with these positions. As my colleague said, we are not looking for differences, we are looking for the common ground in which we can build this consensus. And let me tell you that there is not a different US, it's the same US with a different president. And that happens. So we're not talking, and being with the Japanese on my side, we're talking about millenniums, we're not talking about a presidency. So we have to work with what we have. That's the reality of what we have to face. We have to build a consensus on what we want to achieve and how we want to face that common responsibility that we have. Thank you.
Well, I just would like to add to what my two colleagues mentioned, that we understand the importance and seriousness of the challenges and points that have been made by Dr. Kumar, and also the points that were stressed by Secretary Mehta, and so on. But let's remember always that this is a very cooperative framework. The G20 is a very cooperative framework, and that the fact that we have the largest 20 economies in the world have come together and decided to work together in order to find solutions for the challenges that we face, the global economy faces, is very, very good in itself. And the other very important aspect that of this grouping also is the fact that the leaders of the largest 20 economies are getting together regularly and maintaining this cooperative framework. So this is in itself is a very positive, very positive forum, very positive action. And I think by working together and based on the rules and existing consensus to some extent on many issues and existing frameworks, and we can, world leaders and G20 leaders can work together actually to address these issues. As future president of the G20, we do look forward to building consensus as much as we can around issues that we have, the ability and the possibility of having the consensus built. So I can't speak about, specific, views on that is supposed to happen 2 years from now. But anyway, we're an active member, and we understand and appreciate the importance of the grouping and the importance of working together in addressing the challenges. Thank you.
Just to address the other side of your question. So I haven't had a chance to look at the eminent person's report yet, but I must say I'm not too surprised if there is not a kind of a radical call for a radical relook of the international monetary system, or how you want to call it, Bretton Woods 2, or wherever we are now. And I actually do think that within the confines of the G20, or incentivized by the G20, there has been quite a bit of work on this, not very recently, but especially in the run-up and then during the Chinese presidency. As somebody who invested and spent a few years of my career on these issues, I'll say that I think quite apart from the question whether whatever the solution might be, it is politically feasible, I think the reason why it might not have gotten so much traction in this report is that there is no clear sense of what an alternative could be, or put it the other way around. I would say the international monetary system as we have it, certainly we know it has some weaknesses, but at the same time also it has delivered in many aspects. And conceptually, it is not easy to look at alternatives and to understand or to show that these alternatives might work better or might even work at all. And one clear aspect of that is we did produce, I think a couple of years ago, a fairly in-depth look on the use of the SDR as part of or greater use of the SDR as part of the international monetary system. And again, I think there, just from the conceptual level, there are many difficulties and challenges, and that I think also impedes more traction in that sense. So I think it's easier and maybe also conceptually clearer to focus on some of the weaknesses that we see in the current system. Many of them have to do with the financial safety net, then kind of going all the way to a radical rethink of the model. I don't think that should mean that academics and even the IMF, we should sit on the side and not continue thinking. But I don't think that I think the avenue that has more traction and probably more possibilities of success is the one that focuses on addressing some of the shortcomings that we've been able to identify in the IMS.
May I invite other comments, questions, please, sir?
Good afternoon.
My question is, what is the view of the presidencies on trade wars, protectionism, unemployment, and I see some sort of situation which was there during the Great Depression. Countries are having a lot of foreign exchange. The currencies are getting devalued vis-a-vis the US dollar, rising unemployment, while the developed world wants the goods to be having no barriers, the services are having a lot of barriers now. Now, how, on what issues does the presidencies have consensus, and on what issues do the presidencies wish to build consensus? Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Here. Well, thank you for the question. I think that we want to build consensus in all the issues. So there's not a preference. The only preference that we have are the main issues that I just stressed in my presentation, which we choose them as the key issues for the presidency, so we will very much like to have a consensus on them. The situation, as was pointed out by you, is a little bit different from what it was 10 years ago. And the purpose of the G20 also has evolved with that situation, as it was explained by all of us around here. The main question that we have, and I will maybe go back a little bit to the same way even the ambassador of Saudi Arabia was pointing out before, there are a lot of issues in which we have the opportunity of getting that consensus. We have a leaders-driven exercise, and we hope that at least we give them the time for sitting together and discussing the issues from their perspective, and not from the perspective of having a communiqué already been drafted for them, so we just have a vacuum in terms of what they can discuss. There are parts of that that has to be brought by the different groups. They are already there. As I was telling you, in all the ministerial meetings that we had till now, there is a final document in which we have been able to reach that consensus. Paragraphs of those different ministerials are going to the final declaration, but the aim of the declaration will come from the meeting of the leaders. We hope that we don't get into the crisis that it seems to be coming, that the leaders will be able to avoid that crisis. There are a lot of different issues, as our colleague from the Monetary Fund already expressed. It's not just a financial issue that it's coming, but we have to look at the liquidity that there is in the market. There are some other pressures coming from the trade side. There are some other coming politically, for example, at the level of the international economic and political governance. There is a questioning of multilateralism. Well, things are a little bit uncertain all over there, so what we need is the strength of 20 leaders getting together and trying to assume their responsibility facing this unstable situation, not crisis, but unstable situation in the scene. Thank you.
Mr. Asari, would you like to?
Well, in this the question, the trade issue, well, our position, as you know, is very clear. As Prime Minister has said in various occasions, that we believe that exchange of trade, restrictive trade measures is no one's interest. And it is important that any trade measures must be consistent with WTO. That's our basic position. And I would also like to introduce the part of the remark by our Finance Minister and Deputy Prime Minister Taro Aso at the time of G20 Finance Ministers and Governors meeting in July in Buenos Aires. He pointed out that the imbalance must be addressed through macroeconomic policy and structural reform, as imbalance is a reflection of macroeconomic imbalance, and not by the imposition of tariffs. So these are our basic points, and as I said, Japan will continue to be standard bearer of free trade based on rules. And actually, as seen in the conclusion of TPP or conclusion of Japan-EU free trade economic partnership agreement, we have been taking a lead in this promotion of free trade, and we will continue to do so. And I think, well, as I said, it's too early to talk about the G20 Osaka Summit, but I think whatever the agenda would be, Japan would continue to, on this question of trade, continue to act based upon this basic standpoint.
Ambassador.
Well, thank you very much. I just would like to add that there are certain priorities rather than certain consensus in particular issues, but we have priorities, and especially as members for the time being and present in the future, which we notice that there is great, consensus and on many of them. And I would like to share with you, for example, strengthening economic resilience as a priority of G20, deepening cooperation on trade and investment in so many aspects, and also enhancing and improving employment, further developing financial markets, energy, and empowering women, education, promoting health, digital technology, innovation, fighting corruption, and so on. And many of these priorities have been incorporated within our vision also of 2030 and the transformational program. Thank you.
Your comments, Dr. Bauer? No. Okay.
Very good afternoon. Thank you for making us understand that there is a consensus or not bringing about protectionism or not supporting US. But I would like to know what would the countries actually do possibly to make US understand that they are not in for protectionism, either from the institutional sides or from your own country's perspective. Because when US wishes to put a political pressure, the other countries tend to isolate the other countries, which is a very common thing. But in case of US, we don't see any pressure techniques being adopted by countries, even in the climate change circumstances. US has easily walked away from the Paris Agreement. So I would like to understand how can the countries make US possibly understand that protectionism may not be the right choice.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you so much. Let me tell you that this is a very personal view. I think that when you talk about increasing protectionism, you are not talking only about the US. It's very good for all of us to get the shield of the US as the one raising these or going through these trade wars. But in terms of international trade, they are not the only ones doing that. So I believe that this is a risk that the whole system is facing. What we are against is the unilateral measures being taken without or above the rules that have to govern the world trade. That's something that we have to be opposed. But protectionist measures are everywhere. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Asari?
I think it's we have to be really careful not to oversimplify the question of portray protectionism or issue of protectionism as a U.S. issue, because as Ambassador Chiburu said, protectionism is really related to the entire system, free trading system. If I may point out that, of course, the media attention may focus on the tariff measure of a particular country, but at the same time, equally serious issue is trade distorting subsidies or trade distorting unfair practices. Or Japan shares the U.S. concern on the proper protection of intellectual property rights. And so I think it is very important to work together, for the country to work together to uphold the rule-based free trading system, which includes, as G7 countries' statement said in June, to enforce existing international rules and develop new ones where needed. Thank you.
Would you care to, Ambassador?
If I have to, then I would say that we will be waiting for the outcomes of the current presidency and the coming presidency as we go to move toward 2020.
Okay.
Thank you.
Dr. Bao? No, okay. This is probably a reflection of how rich and interesting this session has been, but I understand we are completely out of time. We've run the clock, so with respect, I'm going to ask our participants if they wish to make any last comment, and then I'm afraid I'll have to call it a day. Well, I'm going to ask our panelists if they wish to yield, then you may.
I yield mine.
Okay.
I'm Dinesh Sharma. My question is directed to the IMF representative. China is very keen to have its own version of IMF. If it happens so, how will IMF see it? Will it be a challenge or an opportunity for the global economy?
I think the same related question, please allow me. Yes, Mandral. My question is still related to IMF economist. Now there has been a controversy whether the Chinese currency should be included in the SDR basket. What about the IMF thinking about?
Wow.
Okay, this is a clear, I think a clear question for me indeed. Well, I don't know. I don't know. I agree with the premise. I don't think, from my experience in dealing with our colleagues from China, that they are intent to have their own version of the IMF. I don't think there can be an own version of the IMF, because the IMF is an institution that has near global membership. And so if not everybody's in, then you don't have really a replica of the IMF. No, I do think that that China, in fact, has been very concerned and very engaged in precisely in the reform of the IMF, in trying to help the IMF adjust to a different reality. And the different reality in the world is, of course, that the epicenter of economic activity has been shifting. It's been shifting east and it's been shifting south. And the IMF, by its statute, is supposed to respond to that in its governance structure. So providing voice and vote to the members in accordance to their weight in the economy is a very important principle of the IMF. And so we've been working with China and all other members on these governance reforms, and we've made some progress with the 14th Quota Review. There is, of course, more to be done, and we would expect China to contribute to that as it has been contributing before. With regard to the SDR, I don't think there has been a controversy. I think the membership has spoken. The renminbi has been included in the SDR basket, and this has been approved by the membership. And it is a reflection very simply of technical facts, which is that the renminbi is being used even increasingly for international transactions in the world, and it therefore has met the criteria that, again, our constitution sets for the membership of the SDR basket. So I think in that sense there is not a controversy. I think one of the principles of the IMF, which is not widely known, but it aligns to the G20 principles, is that while we do have a voting procedure, I would say the large majority of 90% maybe, or even more than that, 95% of our decisions are taken by unanimity. There's a very, very broad, we have a tradition of trying to seek consensus the same way as the G20 does that. And I think that same process applied really when we discussed the SDR basket and when we discussed other issues.
Thank you very much. Would any of the other panelists wish to comment at this point? Okay, so with apologies to all those who haven't been able to be accommodated in terms of commenting or questioning, I'd like to thank the distinguished panelists for extremely interesting and very enriched comments. And thank you all very much. Thank you to the organizers.
Can you sit for? Just wrap up. Thanks. Well, thank you, Mrs. Mehta, and thank you, ambassadors and Deputy Commission member, as well as Dr. Bao. I won't take too much time. Just give me about 5 minutes and we'll close the conference. I just want to the vote of thanks so that you know the people who've been behind this conference. And I think it's been a great success. If you were here yesterday evening, you would have thought this is indeed a place for great intellectual stimulus on a very contemporary issue of cryptocurrencies. And I thought that was something that we included in the conference with a little bit of trepidation, not knowing how it would pan out, but I thought it went really well. But before I sort of I won't try and, as I said, summarize, but just sort of say that this was our 10th conference. We have been organizing this since the very beginning, and I think it was a landmark in some sense for us as well. We've, G20 at 10 and ICRIER at 10. And we thought that we would commemorate this occasion by trying to come out with a volume. We've already come out with 2 volumes on our 2 out of 10 G20 conferences. We've come out with 2 edited books. So we thought that we will come out with another edited book and reach out to some of the speakers who are willing to write papers. And hopefully before the Osaka summit, have that book out and published. And we will also then have our 11th G20 conference. And sometimes we are forced to organize things in a compressed way. The German elections forced us to organize the conference a little early. And I think the Japanese G20 in June will also compel us to try and squeeze in our conference much earlier than usual. So we'll have about 6 months to organize the next G20 conference. But with the support of people like Andreas and IMF and this time Ford Foundation, I'm sure we'll be able to do that. I just wanted to also mention that in terms of the choice of our subjects and in terms of the Sherpa track, the finance track, the choice was really based on what the Argentinian presidency is looking. So the future of work, the sustainable food futures, as well as infrastructure financing, which for India has been a subject on the table. So when India does become the presidency at some point in time, and I know that we will become the presidency, infrastructure financing, and now increasingly, as everybody is saying, sustainable infrastructure financing will be certainly an item of priority for the Indians. And also, it's quite clear, given the push that is happening on trade and protectionism, given as the virtuous cycle, as Mrs. Mehta said, on climate change and growth, these issues will continue to be important for us in India, and ICRIER is working on some of these issues. And hopefully, we'll be able to see the G20 will enable some sort of consensus building, not only within itself, but I think outside in the bigger multilateral system at the UNFCCC, at the WTO, and hopefully there will be some spillover impacts of the G20 on other institutions. And I think that's going to be important because, as everybody has said, it's not a treaty-based organization. It doesn't have legal binding. There is consensus. And at some point, I hope that we are able to drive that consensus both within and without the G20. And, you know, for me, I think this has been a great sort of experience because, I mean, I've sat through, you know, 5 G20 conferences, and I think, and I'm not speaking with an immediacy bias. You know, you always tend to have an immediacy bias, but I think the richness of the discussion, the richness of the topics, and, you know, the dinner talk yesterday makes me feel that this has been one of our more successful in terms of content conferences. And I really thank all of you, of course, all of you for coming and sharing your thoughts, all the speakers, and the audience, of course, that encourages participation. It's like you know, when you go to a classical music concert, an Indian classical music concert, and if there's no audience, then, you know, the musician doesn't feel like performing. And I'm sure that if there is no greater engagement or intense engagement from the floor, then of course you don't bring out the best in the panelists. And I think this time, as Mrs. Mehta also had to cut you short, there was a lot of engagement since the beginning, since yesterday, and all the way up to the last session. So thank you all very much. But before you go, we must also recognize the people who've actually been, you know, meticulously, you know, sending out emails, getting things organized, you know, being the back end of organizing this conference. They're all mentioned at the back of the brochure that you have, but I would also like them to be recognized individually. So could you all please stand up? Tanu Goel, who's here, give her a big round of applause. Pratik, Sharanya is not here. She had to go back home, but she was here yesterday. Manmeet, where is Manmeet? He's gone to airport. He's still working, you see. So is Krishan, and Rajkumar is here. Uma Joshi, Neha, she's also gone to the airport. Krishan is Sharad, and Rajesh, and Preeti. So we started planning for this conference 3 months ago, and you see the people that have contributed to the success. And I must, once again, thank our sponsors, the International Monetary Fund and the Ford Foundation, for their generous support. Thank you all very much.